Hi. Thank you, Misa. Let me just put my video on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our second session online seminar that we are having. We do have on board our director, Dr. Joanne, who is with us. She will have some final words at the end of this workshop. Thank you very much to all those who have joined us. And I'm really happy, guys, with what we are doing with your activities. Please make sure that you also participate on the WhatsApp group and do the activities as requested. As you are aware, this week we are doing vulnerability assessments. We do have Dr. Katharine Vincent. She is a director at Kulima Integrated Development Solutions. She's an expert, especially in this area of climate vulnerability assessment. She has done a lot of adaptation and risk reduction consultants in South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, Kenya, and Ghana. So I will let her introduce herself when the time is up. Just to know that you are on board, guys. Can you just write your names on the charts, or you can open your video and say hi just for a minute? Let's just do something to show that we are here on this platform. Can I see people opening their videos, showing that they are present? Tabo, I can see Hilda, Catherine, yes. Nolutando, Yamkele, so advise, we can see you. Zipo, where are you? I don't see you. Tembakas, can I see your face? Shalom, Solisi, are you guys with us? It's nice to see everyone's face. Oh, Yamkele, you are looking so good. I can see you. Yes, and so advice, clearly we can see you. Yes, that's interesting. Okay, Visham, I can see you. So what we can do, guys, as usual, we just put our names in the chat box so that we know who is present today. Because our time is limited today, I'm not going to take much time. I will hand over straight to Catherine, who is our facilitator for today, to take over this session. Catherine, over to you. And you guys, you may now mute your microphones as well as close your videos. Because of data issues, we might not be able to hear her. So let's keep our videos off as well as our microphones muted. Catherine, now it's time for you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Sandra, and hi everyone. Nice to meet you virtually. Sorry we're not able to see each other in person yet, but hopefully that time will come sooner rather than later. But I'm really excited to be with you this morning to talk about climate vulnerability assessments. Hopefully you can all see the screen here. So we have a couple of hours together today and hopefully the same again next week. So we don't have a lot of time. So what I'm going to try and do is show you a kind of sequence that we can follow to undertake climate vulnerability assessments. So I will give a kind of brief introduction, and then I will present several different steps. And then I'm going to ask, after each step, I'm going to ask you to think about what you would do in that particular step in a community context in which you are familiar. Now, today I'm going to ask all of you to do that individually. And what we might do next week, if we have several people who are working in the same community context, we might be able to put you in groups. But vulnerability assessments are very scale specific. So if we're doing them at community scale, then it's obviously essential everyone is familiar with the same community. So that's why today I'm going to ask you to do the tasks individually. So I hope you have a pen and paper at hand so you can jot down thoughts when we get to the relevant stages. And I would also like to encourage you to be as participatory as possible. So after each step, and when I've asked you to think about certain things, we've got time factored in for feedback. And of course, we all learn well together. We learn much better together than when we're just doing things by ourselves. So please be willing to share your thoughts on what you've done for your particular context, because that will also help others to learn as well. Just to say as well on climate vulnerability assessments, yeah, I have to say I've done some pretty rapid vulnerability assessments in my time, but never one in 4 hours. So this is definitely pushing the boundaries time-wise, but it is perfectly possible to do a climate vulnerability assessment with relatively low resources and a relatively short period of time. That said, of course, the more time and resources you have to invest in them, into data collection, into analysis and so on, you can do exceptionally complex vulnerability assessments as well. But please don't be put off. I often hear people say, oh, but I can't do this because I don't have time, I don't have the resources, I don't have the capacity in statistical analysis. All of that doesn't matter. It's still perfectly possible to do a judgment-based vulnerability assessment. And that's what we're going to look at today. Okay, first of all, just to start us off, this word vulnerability, we hear this a lot in a lot of different contexts. So I'd just like to start off by asking all of you to have a quick think and just jot down in the chat box either a word or a couple of words that describes what vulnerability means to you. What do you think of when you hear the term vulnerability? I'll just give you a few minutes to do that. Powerless, at risk of being hurt or damaged. Yep. Damaged, worn out. Yep. Lack of control. Easily hurt or attacked, helpless. Exposed. Okay, I'm going to come back to exposed, but yes, risk of being hurt or damaged. Okay, great. So breakable, lonely. Yep. So a lot of different words, but a lot of kind of similar sentiments reflected in those words. And actually, there was someone writing back in 1980, kind of 40 years ago now, saying that the word vulnerability is a term that we can use so broadly that it can actually be quite problematic for describing anything in particular, but it's an indicator of areas of concern. So powerlessness, risks, exposure and risk. I'm going to hold on to those because I'm definitely going to come back to those. Distractive, hopeless. Yeah, all of these things. I mean, other things that we sometimes think about with regards to vulnerability, things like susceptibility, fragility, marginality. Yeah, so I think we're all kind of on the same page with regards to vulnerability. Okay. Now I've put here on the slide, this is the official definition of vulnerability, which is used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I know you've had a seminar already with Francois Engelbrecht, who is one of South Africa's authors for the climate science team for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is basically the membership of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is actually all the governments of the world, but what they do every so often is convene groups of scientists from around the world to assess the state of our knowledge on climate change, what's causing it, what it's likely to look like in the future, and of course, crucially, how we can reduce risk and adapt and reduce vulnerability. So of course, in a scientific definition, we have lots of jargon and lots of buzzwords, but they say the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. Vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts and elements, including sensitivity or susceptibility to harm and lack of capacity to cope and adapt. So the wording might be slightly different, but the sentiment there is totally in keeping with all the thoughts that you've just put into the chat box. And basically, vulnerability is about the risk of negative consequences and the propensity for harm. And one thing that I think is really important to note is that vulnerability is very much hazard or stress specific. So you can have different levels of vulnerability to different things. You know, we often talk about vulnerable groups of the population, and on aggregate, yes, it may well be that women, the elderly, youth, for example, have reasons for vulnerability kind of on aggregate. But what we want to do in a climate vulnerability assessment is kind of unpack that a little bit further and look at the specific vulnerability in the context of climate and climate hazards, which might be different to vulnerability to other stresses and other hazards which exist. Okay, so this diagram here, if you're looking for anything to do with climate and vulnerability online or in scientific literature, you're likely to come across this particular diagram. This first came out actually in the IPCC report that looked at disaster risk, but then the most recent report on adaptation, impacts and vulnerability, which is now quite old, it's from 2014, had this diagram, and I suspect that the 6th assessment report, Working Group 2, will have something very similar when it will be released early next year. And what we've got here basically, as you can see in the middle, we've got risk being related to hazards and vulnerability and exposure. And so often, actually, when we talk about vulnerability assessments, we're actually kind of talking about risk assessments, and we're needing to take into account all of these different components. Because the reason that vulnerability matters and the reason that we want to look at it is that we're not all affected in the same way by climate change. There are different levels of risk to different places and to different people. And of course, we need to understand that if we want to be able to effectively reduce that risk and adapt to the consequences of climate change. So what we're going to do now is basically take each of these in turn, the hazards, the exposure and the vulnerability, and look at what that means and look at how we might be able to explore that in a community context. But before I do that, I'm going to relate these terms to an example which all of us have heard all too much about over the last 18 months, just to show how this works, regardless of the particular hazard that we're thinking about. So obviously, coronavirus was probably a term that not many of us had ever thought about or used before March 2020, although coronaviruses have been around obviously for a long time. Now, of course, it's common parlance, and this is a hazard which exists in the world. We're doing our best to get rid of that hazard, but at the moment it exists for all of us, and none of us can get rid of the hazard. But the coronavirus virus only lives within hosts, i.e. people. And so whilst the hazard is there for all of us, we all have different levels of exposure to that hazard, which is based on basically how often we come into contact with other people, because those other people are the hosts of the virus. So already you can see, even if we all know that the hazard is there, the exposure can differ. It can differ based on your occupation, for example. So if you're working by yourself and you're able to get someone to deliver your groceries to you, you may never have to leave the house. You may never come into contact with anyone, so your exposure in the context of that hazard is very low. But of course, if you're someone who's working in a medical facility, coming into contact with lots of people who are known hosts of coronavirus because they're infected, then of course your exposure is going to be much higher. But then it's not even just about exposure, it's also about vulnerability. And again, in the context of coronavirus, we've heard a lot over the last 18 months about aspects of vulnerability which affect how likely it is, how much at risk we are of getting infected. So things like age, gender and weight, they can all really increase your vulnerability if you're exposed to the coronavirus hazard, also pre-existing medical conditions. So for example, let's say we have a person working in a healthcare facility who's an older man who's a bit overweight and has hypertension and diabetes. That person is going to be at significantly greater risk of coronavirus than, say, a young woman who's able to, who has no health conditions and is able to isolate themselves from the situation. So you can see how vulnerability is important here and exposure is important, because it's not just about the hazard, it's about how the exposure and the vulnerability interact to create the different levels of risk. And then it's not even just about those as being static, because we also have the opportunity to modify the exposure and the vulnerability. We can't necessarily do too much about the hazard itself, certainly not in the short term and not on an individual basis, but we can affect our exposure and we can affect our vulnerability. And in the kind of climate sense, we would talk about that as developing adaptive capacity. So again, we all know what the tools are for adaptive capacity in the context of coronavirus. We know that we need to wash our hands, wear a mask, keep physical distance, work from home if we can. All of those things can reduce our exposure and reduce our vulnerability, and as a result, reduce the risk that we will become infected. And this very same context and kind of conceptual framework of these different components interacting together is exactly the same with climate. So these arrows here just showing that we can determine where that risk is. So we take a climate example. Here, if we look at the pictures here on the top left, we've got a female farmer growing a crop, and on the bottom right, we've got a female truck driver. Now let's imagine these two are neighbours living in exactly the same community. So the hazard that's around is drought. Both of them are going to know that there's drought around because they're physically in the same place and that hazard is physically present. But the exposure levels to that drought are very different. For the farmer, exposure to drought is significant because her livelihood, the crop, is dependent on there being adequate rain. Whereas for the truck driver, her exposure to drought is fairly minimal because she's not dependent on natural resources for her livelihood. So that hazard can be there, but she doesn't have a high exposure to it. Then if we look at vulnerability for the farmer, so the hazard is there and the exposure is there. Now the level of vulnerability will depend on lots of different factors. It will depend on access to information. Does this farmer know that the drought is likely to come? Therefore, is she able to do things to reduce her risk? Does she have access to sufficient resources to plant something different if she needed to? Perhaps plant a drought-tolerant variety of crop, those kind of things. So again, you can see the risk levels for this particular example of climate for drought can vary significantly, and we need to understand the levels of exposure and the levels of vulnerability if we're to have a chance of being able to work out what to do about that. So the key, I think, we can change the exposure, but the vulnerability is what we typically focus on. So if you have a farmer who's exposed to drought and vulnerable to drought and doesn't have access to information, for example, that's not that difficult to sort out. We know we have good weather information about droughts. We know that South African Weather Service is providing information. So sometimes reducing that vulnerability is just a case of connecting the information with the person that needs to have it, so that she can reduce her vulnerability and therefore that reduces her risk. But also just to point out here, again, the key thing to remember, of course, with vulnerability is the context and the hazard stress specificity. So rather than just thinking about who is vulnerable and who isn't, it's who is vulnerable and who isn't in the context of a particular hazard. So the lady driving the truck, she may not be at high risk of drought, may not have vulnerability to drought, but of course there are plenty of other hazards and stresses that her livelihood will be exposed to, that she'll be vulnerable to. For example, fuel prices, and of course fuel prices, depending on policy responses to deal with climate change, that can affect fuel prices. So again, just to kind of bear in mind that vulnerability is not a yes/no situation, it's more what's the nature of vulnerability for different people in the context in which they're working. Now, this is another kind of idiom which is in the climate world has received a lot of attention in recent months. And again, I think it's because we've said it a lot in the context of coronavirus. So, you know, this phrase that we have in English where we say, oh, we're all in the same boat, meaning the situation is the same for all of us. Well, it's technically not actually true. We may all be in the same storm, the same water, but actually, depending on our levels of vulnerability and our exposure, we may actually be in different boats. And again, the different boats that we're in will affect the level of risk that we're at from the storm. So just wanted to point out, next time, if you hear someone say we're all in the same boat, just think to yourself, do they mean we're in the same boat? Or do they mean that we're in the same storm?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And then just to comment on, you know, why we would want to do a vulnerability assessment. So of course, the first one is, and hopefully this is becoming obvious already, is to identify the nature of risk. Risk varies. It varies based on the hazard and the exposure and the vulnerability. And if we want to understand those different levels of risk, we need to understand those different components. We'll also want to do climate vulnerability assessments because, of course, forewarned is forearmed. If we know what vulnerability is, then we can do things about it to try and reduce it so that we reduce risk for people. And I know within the context of this project, you will have the opportunity to develop adaptation projects. So hopefully, if you're able to conduct a climate vulnerability assessment, then that will inform what your adaptation project should look like so that they can be most effective for the greatest number of people. So it is, again, this key thing that exposure, the hazards themselves are not necessarily always easy to change, but we definitely can change the exposure and we can change the vulnerability. And so if we know where and for whom it's necessary to do that, then we can know what to do. And so that helps us define our adaptation projects. Okay, let me just pause there in case anyone has any questions thus far. That's just my brief overview of vulnerability assessments and the components of vulnerability and risk. Is that all clear for anyone, or would anyone like to ask any questions?
Another question from me, Catherine, just to note though to the participants that just joined, to please change their names. So please rename yourself if you logged in as your device so that we know who's here. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kunisa. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Does that mean everything is crystal clear? I hope so.
Yeah, I do hope so. Okay, there is a question. Kuli, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's me, Kuli. Yes, thank you. I don't clearly hear you. I don't know whether I didn't hear you clear. That the person who is in the truck is not vulnerable. Are you saying so?
No, I'm saying given vulnerability is you're vulnerable to a specific hazard. So I was giving the example of the hazard being drought. So in the case of drought, that truck driver is not particularly vulnerable to drought because her livelihood is not contingent on directly on natural resources. But that's is a very important point. No, I'm definitely not saying she's not vulnerable at all. I'm just saying in the context of drought as the hazard, she's not particularly vulnerable. I'm sure there are plenty of other hazards to which she would be vulnerable. And thanks, Nkuli, that is a really key point, because if you take one thing away from the session today, it's that, you know, we cannot assess vulnerability without being explicit about the hazard, or the vulnerability to what are we talking about, because a vulnerability to climate could be very different to the vulnerability to fuel prices. That was the example I gave for that, or the vulnerability to disease, or, you know, vulnerability to any of the other hazards or stresses that exist. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, I hear, but because I was going to say that the person in the truck is one of them who caused the climate, because of the force fluids that is coming from the truck, and also the soil is using the truck all the time, and the soil is going to be, there is going to be a soil erosion. That's what I was thinking in my mind. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also, I mean, you've just highlighted the complexity of all of these issues, is that, you know, there's a lot of driving forces at play. But yes, certainly vulnerability is, we talk about vulnerability in the context of a particular hazard. Any other questions, or please do feel free to, you can also, if you're shy to speak, feel free to also put in the chat box. It's obviously just in this context when I can't see if anyone's looking confused or not understanding me. So I'm relying on you to speak up if anything is not clear.
Okay, I think it's, I don't see any questions. So I do think as we progress as well, all the questions will be addressed to. Please, guys, feel free, if you don't understand anything or any term, please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat so that it can be addressed immediately. I think we can go ahead, Katharine.
Great. Okay. So now what we're going to do, so that's kind of, I wanted to give a brief overview. And now, as I said, we're going to kind of tackle each of these colored parts of this blade diagram in turn. So we're going to focus first on the hazard, because as we've said, the vulnerability, you have to be vulnerable in the context of a specific hazard. And if we're assessing climate vulnerability, then we need to understand the hazard context that we're talking about. So what climate hazards are there? When we think about climate, what hazards do we have? Well, there's the two main ones which we maybe think about the most is the incremental increase in temperature. So again, I'm sure in the previous seminars you've covered this. The global average temperature is increasing as a result of emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, primarily as a result of human activities, and that changes temperature patterns. It increases temperature. So all of us, the world is likely to continue to warm. As all of us get older, the extent to which it warms will depend on some of the policy decisions we make now about greenhouse gases. But temperature increase is a climate hazard, which is important for all of us. The other one is change in rainfall. And this one's a bit trickier to work out because there's a lot of different factors affect rainfall, the interaction of the atmosphere and the oceans, and then small scale factors like topography and the relief of the land. I'm sure, as you know, you can travel from one community to the next one a couple of kilometers away and find the weather is totally different, even though relatively speaking they're close together. So that just highlights that that rainfall is is more variable than temperature. And because of that, it's very difficult for us to accurately project what rainfall is going to be like in the future. I will show you some of the projections for South Africa, and I'm sure you did look at them previously. But basically, two definite climate hazards that we have are temperature increase and rainfall, change in rainfall. Then in addition to that, we have a number of extreme events. And again, the kind of frequency, how often these extreme events occur, and the intensity of these extreme events is going to be affected by climate change. Particularly, if you think kind of in the physics of the atmosphere, a lot of extreme weather is based on the energy that's available. So if we have a warming world, which we know we will have, then a lot of these extreme events are going to be more frequent or more severe. So storms, we're going to have change in storm frequency and in intensity. Flooding is going to also be continue to be an issue in a context of a changing climate. And that flooding can be river-based flooding, coastal flooding for those that are in coastal areas, and also flash flooding. Drought, again, that was the example I used earlier on. But drought is a climate hazard that we need to be aware of. And then this last one here is to represent tropical cyclones. Now, obviously in South Africa, we're not in the direct line of most tropical cyclones because we're a bit too far south. But of course, our neighbours in Mozambique are often very exposed to cyclones. And we know that sometimes the aftermath of the cyclones as they travel westwards overland affects our weather in terms of storminess as well. So climate hazards that we need to be aware of with climate change: temperature increase, rainfall change, storms, floods, droughts, and cyclones. Those are all examples of climate hazards. Now, what I'd like you to do now for your first exercise, so this is just for you to think about by yourself for a community in which you are familiar. I want you to think about if there are any trends that you've observed in weather conditions over the recent past. So you know how it is, we often say, oh, it's got so hot, oh, it's much hotter than it used to be, or oh, you know, the rains are starting much later than they used to start in the past. Are there any trends that you have noticed or that you've heard spoken about in a community in which you're familiar? So things that you can think about are temperatures, including extremes of temperatures, so hot days, hot nights, cold days and cold nights. Are there any trends in rainfall? How often the rain falls, how intense it is when it falls, when the rainy season, how long the rainy season lasts, or the characteristics of the rainy season. So, you know, maybe you've noticed increasing dry spells within the rainy season or unpredictability. What about extreme events? Over recent past, are there any trends that you've noticed in terms of droughts, in terms of floods, in terms of storms, anything like that? Or indeed any other weather-related phenomena in your particular community context that you've noticed changing over time? So I'm just going to give you 10 minutes or so to have a think about that. Please jot down your answers, and then I will ask a couple of you to just explain what you've come up with.
Okay, so just checking, do we all understand the activity? If you don't, please raise your hand so that we clarify. So you are doing it as an individual where you are. If you are in groups of 3 or in group whatever number you have there, you do it in that group. If you are alone, you do the activity on your own. Sanele?
Hello, Sandra. Can you please repeat a question for me?
Okay. So she said that where you are or where you are, you have to identify the trends that you have observed in weather conditions. So what are the changes that you have noticed? Whether it's maybe the temperatures are high, or the temperatures are getting cold, or the rainfall is getting less, or we are getting more rainfall? Are we having droughts or floods? What are the trends in terms? Remember, we said we learned about weather, or we learned up on climate. So we are saying, what are the changes or the trends that we have observed over the past years, or past years? You can look at 5 years or 10 years. What are the changes that you have noticed?
Yeah, the time period. I mean, even, you know, maybe, you know, in a community, you've heard the grandparents saying, "Oh no, in the past, you know, that this didn't happen. It used to be very different." You know, the time frame is not so important, but just any trends that you're aware of, or that you've heard other community members speak of in a community context in which you're familiar.
Okay. Do we understand, guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you are doing that where you are as an individual, or if you are 2 or 3, you do that as a group.
Yeah, and please do write it down, because we're going to use this information as we go forward. So we need to keep a note of it, please.
There are new participants that just joined, Sandra. If you don't mind explaining the activity, okay?
If I want to connect her automatically, then.
Yeah, I can explain again. So, or do you want to do it, Sandra?
No, you can go ahead, Catherine.
Now, for anyone who's just joined, welcome. We're just thinking through the different stages of a climate vulnerability assessment, and the first one is to think about climate hazards and the context of climate hazards. So I'm asking you to think about a community in which you're familiar, and think about what trends have been observed either by yourself or that you've heard others mention of, to do with weather and climate in that particular community. So anything to do with temperatures or rainfall or extreme events, droughts, floods. Is there anything you've heard people comment about? Oh, it's hotter than it used to be, it's colder than it used to be, it's wetter than it used to be, anything like that? I'd just like you to note it all down. Okay, so Nasipa, I see in the chat, last year there's no rain the whole last year and people don't plant anything, but now it's changing. We have rains and hot days. Yeah, so that's an example. If it wasn't just last year, but if it's a general trend that rain is becoming more variable, or rainy season is starting later, or the droughts are becoming more frequent, that's the type of thing I'd like you to write down. You're welcome to write them in the chat box, but definitely please write them down for yourselves. And I will ask a few of you to explain in a minute, to share with others. Please try and think about as many of those different weather examples as you can for the area that you're familiar with. About 2 more minutes to complete that, and then I'm going to ask you to share some feedback. And the key thing also to think about here is the change. What's different now compared to what it used to be in the past. Okay, this is great to read some examples in the chat box. Was anyone brave and would like to unmute themselves and share verbally? And when you do that, please tell us which particular location you're talking about as well.
Hi, this is Katharine.
Hi, please go ahead.
I'm from Manfresh Advice Center.
Great.
Yes, I will share my information.
Please do. Sounds good. Go ahead.
In the past few years, it was on 2015, there's a lot of drought here. So the rain was scarce on that time. The water was scarce. Also, dams and also the wells has dry. Some people supposed to wake up in the morning to go and fetch some waters so that they can be able to have water in their own rooms. And also the grass were dry. So some of the livestock were not getting to eat verbally. So this livestock end up dying. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask you a few questions on that? So was that a one-off occurrence, or is that the first time that that's happened, or is it happening more frequently in the past? Or just trying to work out, was that an unusual event, or is it part of a trend that's being seen?
Come again, Ms. Katharine?
Is it? I'm just wondering. Was it a one-off event, that drought situation, or is it a changing trend in that droughts are occurring where they didn't occur previously, or they're worse than they were previously? It's particularly the kind of the trend and the change in time that I'm keen to find out about.
Yeah, the changes, because our local municipality try to give us some waters to the Jojo tanks, and in this years there is a lot of rain, so the water will not scarce because it takes 4 to 5 days when it's rain, so there is no scarce of water.
Okay.
And also the grass is green right now, so the livestock get something to eat.
Okay, so the trend could be possibly increasing variability, where you have some years where it's fine and some years where it's drought.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else like to share? I've got so many things on my screen. I'm afraid I can't see the participants' names easily if I keep my presentation where I can see it. So
no problem. I also have some corporates who are not doing the homework, so I will test them here today. Then Yamkela, can we hear your responses? After Yamkela, then it's Prim.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. What I've noticed there in Mount Frey, I try and our seasons are longer. Honestly, they seem and tend to last longer than they usually do. Last season, summer, it felt like summer lasted 5 or 6. It felt like summer lasted 5 or 4 months because it was so hot. It was very, very hot. And when winter came, it started raining during the winter season because we experienced like 60% chances of rain and 80% chances of rain during the June season, which was this year. And then we had extreme events because as last week something happened. We experienced a thunderstorm which was very, very big and unusual in our region because we usually have those around December and November. That was very unusual. And when I asked other people about it, they told me it's something that's been happening for the past 3 years. It usually happens. So it's a new trend for them. They usually used to thunderstorms in November and December. And when it comes to rainfall has been unusual. It's been unusual in our region because, as I told you, in winter we had 80% chances of rain, and that was in winter, you know. In September too, there's also rainy, less wind, but more rain. And then October came, still more rain, and the temperatures got high. I think this week we had 30 degrees for 3 days. It was 36, 35, and 37. And that is very, very unusual in our region. That's a trend. It's the basic trend is, I could say, it's the seasons last longer than usual. You know, they are less longer than usual, and their effect is more extreme than usual. That's the trend as of now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I think those are good examples, because I think, you know, what we hear about a lot with climate change is the hazards that we experience are becoming more variable over time. And you know, the key when we're doing climate vulnerability assessments, the key is to work out what that specific variability looks like of those hazards in the context in which we're working. That's great, thank you. Can I have one more volunteer to share? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, it was myself. Thank you very much. I will be talking around BCM, which is East London, King Williamstown area. We have experienced extreme weather conditions, especially when it comes to heat. It gets very hot. It goes up to 39 degrees centigrade, and that is very hot. Yet again, we have very cold days, and they are prolonged. Your winter is, we are able to cease to experience this thing. Winters up to snowfalls up to October, which was not like that in the past. And when the rain does come, we do get flooding, especially in East London. There are floods warning. There are also windstorms whereas you get warned that the winds will be traveling at more than 25 kilometers per hour. And right now at BCM, especially in East London and Tanzania, the dam levels are very low. We're approaching day zero. It's 23% in East London and 18% in Tanzania. So we are really approaching day zero, and it is very worrisome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, gosh. Also a range of different hazards and trends being shown. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear. Of course, I mean, so there we've just heard a few different locations, and I can see, you know, a lot more mentioned in the chat box. Obviously, the other thing to bear in mind is, particularly when we're focusing at kind of high resolution at kind of community scale, of course, the specific hazard context of climate hazards differs, you know, significantly from place to place. So again, this is why it's important for us to interrogate these issues. And if you're conducting a climate vulnerability assessment, to get this kind of information, you've got a couple of different options. You know, perhaps your most basic would just be to have some discussions in the communities that you're working in to kind of build on people's collective memory, you know, particularly the older members of the community. They can remember a long way back, so they should be able to give some insights into, you know, what's changed over time and how these different parameters, these different weather variables have changed over time. I can reflect on some research work that I did in a community in Limpopo province once, and of course I've been asking lots of questions in different contexts about climate-related issues, and a gentleman, an older gentleman, came over to me with his notebook once, and he said, "Oh, I can see you're interested in the climate. I thought I could share this with you." And it turned out it was a diary that he'd kept over many years, And he'd made notations about, like it was particularly hot these days, and it rained particularly hard on these other days. So, this is all kind of good contextual information for understanding what the climate hazards look like in the past and how there have been some changes. Of course, another thing. Maybe can I ask you just to mute yourselves if you're not speaking, because I'm getting a bit of interference. That's better. Another thing you can do if you're conducting climate vulnerability assessment at community level, of course, we do have weather stations and rain gauges in lots of places. Farmers, I find, are often a very useful source of past weather information, because they often have at least their own rain gauges. And of course, South African Weather Service maintains lots of weather stations where we can get actual data and we can look at what's happened in the past. So again, depending on how much time and how much effort you have available to put into your climate vulnerability assessment determines how much effort you want to go to for here. But looking at what's gone on in the past and particularly focusing on the changing trends, what are the changing trends over time, is quite useful to understand the climate context. But of course, there is a bit of a proviso with that, because whilst it's important to look at changing trends over the past, it's not always enough. We can use the analogy of driving, and we can't drive forwards only if we're looking in the rearview mirror. We need to look in the rearview mirror to drive successfully, but if we're only looking in the rearview mirror, we're going to run into problems. And the same is the case for climate change, because what we're going to see in the future is going to be different to what we've seen in the past. So if we're wanting to design adaptation projects and risk reduction projects, we can't just design them considering what the past conditions have been like. We've also got to consider what the future conditions are going to be like. And I've put here a couple of diagrams and projections. These are from the third national communication to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So as we are a party to that particular international agreement, we are obliged to report on our national circumstances every couple of years through these national communications. And in those, we have to include projections about what we expect future climate to look like. So this is, you can make out, obviously we've got South Africa on the map here, and these are projections for what future temperature will look like. So this is in the period 2081 to 2099, using a fairly high emissions scenario, which is known as 8.5, RCP 8.5. This shows us the extent of annual mean temperature change that we're likely to see. And I think that the reason we've got 6 boxes here is that it's downscaled from 6 different global climate models. But obviously what's key is that when you look at the scale goes from red to green, red being an increase and green being a decrease. And of course, there's no green on those diagrams at all. Nowhere in South Africa is going to have a decrease in temperature. We're only going to have an increase. And even though there's some variability between the different models, what we can see is the extent of the temperature increase is going to be greater the further inland we go from the coast. But we're definitely going to continue to see temperature increase. So it's highly likely in your communities there may be records that temperature has been increasing already. That is going to continue, and the order of magnitude of that change may be greater in the future than it's been in the past. With rainfall, as I said, rainfall is much trickier to model effectively because it's contingent on the interaction of so many different factors. But nonetheless, this is what global climate models downscaled show for rainfall for us in South Africa, again over the same time period, similar time period, 2080 to 2099, and under the same high emissions scenario. So here, red is a decrease and green is an increase. And what we can see over most of those models are projecting that over most of the country, we're going to have a decrease in the annual total rainfall. There's that one model on the bottom left does show a slight increase in some areas, but generally speaking, the annual total rainfall is likely to decrease. Although, of course, there's a bit of a proviso with that. Annual totals don't say anything about the distribution of rains within a year. So often, for example, for places where the rainfall is not projected to change at all in terms of annual totals, people think, oh, okay, well, it's not going to be any different to how it is now. But what you may find is that the total amount of rain that falls in the year is the same, but if all of that rain is falling in 2 very high intensity storms, which cause lots of flash flooding, that's not as ideal as if it's distributed nice and evenly throughout the rainy season as it might have been in the past. So rainfall is more problematic than temperature, but we definitely also need to take into account that the changes that we see in the future are going to be an order of magnitude different to even the trends that we've seen in the past. Something else I just wanted to point out from the third national communication, and this document is freely available. You can find it easily online, so it's perfectly accessible. Is what they've done is they've taken each province and they've developed 2 scenarios of what the future climate might look like. So again, they've taken into account what we expect in terms of aggregate trends, but also what that might look like for different provinces. So as you can see, all of them are to do with warmer or hotter, but the extent to which they mention rainfall varies, and some talk about wetter futures and some talk about drier futures. So again, something to bear in mind when you're assessing the nature of climate hazards when undertaking a vulnerability assessment is to kind of bear in mind the large scale projections, but you can also kind of compare and contrast that with the trends that you've seen. And a couple of climate scientists will say, you know, a rule of thumb is to think of the trends that you're already seeing and basically think that those trends are going to become more extreme in the future. So again, I'm just kind of highlighting this to show that, you know, you can do a vulnerability assessment where you're getting climate modelers to run novel information downscaled to a particular region, but you can also take a slightly lower tech perspective where you're using publicly available information combined with trends that you've picked up from a particular context. So that brings us to the next exercise I would like you to think about. So I'd ask you all to write down the changing trends that you've seen already in the communities that you're working in. Now what I'd like you to think about is which ones are the key climate hazards for your particular location. You can choose up to 5. You don't need to choose 5. You might say, oh, we're not so worried about, you know, the temperature changes a bit, but it doesn't, you know, that doesn't matter so much. We're more concerned about the rainfall related ones. But now I'd like you to take your list and put a kind of prioritization of the climate hazards that you think are key in your location. Again, I'll just give you a few minutes to do that, and then I'm going to ask a few of you also to feedback and explain why you've identified those ones as key. Is that clear for everyone what I'm asking you to do?
Maybe Catherine, if you can give an example of one hazard so that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, if I'd done the last exercise for a community that I know well, I'm actually going to, in my mind, I'm picking one in Malawi that I've done research in over many years. So I know that the changing trends in climate that are seen there is that the rainy season starts later. There are dry spells within the rainy season. The temperature is increasing. There's increased number of storms and increased number of high winds. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, that's 5 different climate trends that are relevant for that particular community. but the ones that are particularly key in the context of that community are the later start to the rainy season and the dry spells within the rainy season, and the increasing temperatures. So those would be, if someone said to me, of all of the trends that are important there, which are the key ones, I would pick those 3 for that particular context. So what I'm asking you all to do now is, for the trends that you've already picked up on, identify the key ones, the ones which are the most important for that particular location. Is that clear for everyone?
I do think so.
Great. I'll just give one or 2 minutes to do that, and then, yeah, I'm going to ask a few of you just to explain that.
One more.
Okay, I see a few in the chat box: drought and floods, drought. Okay, I see a few coming in the chat box. Great. Would anyone like to unmute themselves and share the ones they've chosen as key and explain why that is?
Lutando, can we hear from you what you have said?
Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
In my area, I can see the health hazards. There are a lot of changes in our health because of the climate change. You find that when it's too cold, when we are sick, and it's too hot, we are sick. There are also droughts and soil erosions. When it rains a lot, in such that it causes some erosions.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Yeah.
You're jumping ahead. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, don't worry, we're gonna get to that, the kind of impacts of the hazards. But for now, I just want you to focus on. Don't worry, that's fine. We'll still use that information. But for now, I just want you to focus on the climate hazard. So from what I just heard, I heard temperature. You said the temperature was involved in making people sick, right? And drought.
Okay.
So no. So you've got the right information there, but you've just gone you've got one step ahead. So I heard temperature, drought, and was there another weather related aspect other than temperature and drought? Or was it just those two? Was it just temperature and drought? I was hearing that it was weather related, or was there another one that I missed?
I'm not sure if you missed anything. Let's move on, Catherine, and find someone to give their response. Step Up Association, can we hear your responses? step up. Luke and your group, what did you discuss?
Hi. We discussed obviously the key climate assets for our location, which are increased temperature. So that means extreme heat basically, and then there's less rainfall. But it's weird because there's less rainfall, but when the rain comes, it comes in abundance. So it'll be in the form of a storm. So there'd be extreme heat for like 3 weeks maybe, and then all of a sudden on the forecast you see there's a storm, and then there's an abundance of rainfall. And obviously in Cape Town in 2019, I think from 2017 till 2019, we experienced a very severe drought. So that's what we got.
Great.
Thanks so much, Luke. I also used to get confused when people say that there's less rainfall, but they are also complaining that there are floods. Yeah, I couldn't figure it out, but yeah, it's actually happening.
Definitely, and actually, that's an important one to point out, because that's a key element that we're going to see with climate change. You know, when scientists are talking about climate change, we often talk about averages over a year. So we talk about what's the average rainfall that falls throughout the whole year. But actually, that information isn't as important to, you know, our lives and our day-to-day livelihoods as when that rain is falling, and, you know, how intense it's falling, or, you know, for how long a period it's not falling. So in a way, I think it's a little bit of an idiosyncrasy of climate science that we focus a little bit on a measurement that's not actually that useful. And it is definitely the case that total rainfall amounts may not differ at all, or they may even go down, but we'll still have flooding because the distribution of the rains within the season is highly likely to change. And we know that, I mean, a warmer atmosphere is able to hold more moisture, and therefore the likelihood of us getting very intense rainfall events is much higher than it was in the past. So it's an important one to point out, that just because the average rainfall may decrease doesn't mean we're not going to have those extreme rainfall events.
Okay. So I'll just pick a few for Catherine, then I think we'll go ahead. So Bukeka Guda, can we hear your responses?
Okay, good day, everybody. What we've experienced here in our area in Bizana is that there have been frequent storms in the past 5 years, and they occur in very drastic ways. They destroy buildings, trees, and crops. Another thing is I can say it's a hazard as well, that the rainfall just become constant for weeks. And they happen sometimes in winter, which is not our normal rainfall season, but they come pouring in winter. And there's also drastic temperature change patterns, you know, that happen in one day. That would be extremely hot in the morning, and by 3 o'clock, it will just change to be very cold. So those are new things. We were not used to them, but now we can just see that there is a change in our climate.
Great. Thank you. So in terms of kind of key climate hazards there, the temperature extremes within a day, plus the variability in rainfall, plus the storms. Those were the kind of the key climate hazard part that I was hearing from your feedback there.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Maybe we have one more.
Okay, we have Alice Dell. Okay, Alice Dell. Okay, let's hear from Freddie. Freddie Kaufman.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Hi there.
Hi, Freddie.
I think for especially in our community, what we find is that the temperature is it's increasing, especially in summer, and then it's you're getting extremely low temperatures in winter. The other thing also is that the rainfall season this year much more longer versus in 2020, where we experienced that there was almost no water by November, December in the river that is passing by. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So again, it's fascinating to hear all of these different examples, because there's some similarities, but there's also, quite a lot of differences of which particular hazards are most important in different locations. So again, this is showing us why it's important for us to do climate vulnerability assessments, because we really need to understand the hazard context and also the exposure and vulnerability if we're going to be successful in reducing risk and promoting adaptation. Great. Okay. Let me move on then. So we've looked at the kind of the climate hazard context that we have, but that's obviously only one part of the risk framework. So we've done the dark blue, the hazards. Now I'd like us to move on to exposure, the one down at the bottom right of the risk framework. And as we saw with the drought example and with the coronavirus example, even when those hazards are occurring in particular locations, doesn't mean that everyone or every location is always exposed in the same way. And I think if we think kind of geographically, in terms of the spatial exposure, this is also really fascinating to look at from a kind of community perspective, because for those of you that were keen on geography at school, I'm a geographer, so I'm fascinated with place and differences between place, kind of understanding, why we have highlands, why we have lowlands, why we have rivers in some places and not in others. These kind of things all affect the level of exposure to some of these climate hazards that we've identified. So here on this slide, I've got two examples of hazard and resource maps that have been developed with communities. And again, when you're conducting climate vulnerability assessments with communities, working together to kind of unpack some of these issues, I think it is really helpful to use kind of hazard and resource maps like this, because particularly for hazards like floods, flooding, your exposure to flooding is much greater if you're on the floodplain than if you're in an upland area. And so understanding the kind of particular geography of the context helps you see which areas are most exposed to hazards. So as an example of differences in exposure, so this is a photo of Alex in Joburg, and you can see, so we've got the river in the foreground here. Now these houses that are very close to the river, that are shown with the kind of middle arrow, they will be much more exposed to flooding than the houses further back. But the other thing to bear in mind with exposure is what tends to happen is that the people who are poorest and most marginalized end up being most exposed to hazards. So, I mean, if we look at the differences in housing in this particular photo, the houses that are closest to the river are much more kind of temporary and less permanently constructed than the ones further back. And this tends to happen a lot all around the world, that the most vulnerable people find themselves in the locations which are most exposed. So living on hill slopes, for example, that puts you, makes you much more exposed to there being a landslide if there's heavy rainfall than someone who's not living on a slope. So looking, as well as the hazard, we also need to look at how exposure differs for different people and differs in different locations. So in order to do this, we really do need to understand the different geography of different locations so that we can look at how exposure differs in light of the climate hazards that we've identified. So we need to kind of understand the community context and the resource context. So we need to know things like what the natural environment is like, what's the topography and the relief like, is this steep land, is this gently rolling land, is this flat land? Are there water courses? Are there rivers? Are there lakes? Is it near a coast? Some of us are working in coastal locations, others are far from the coast. So if we're not close to the coast, then we're not likely to be exposed to a tropical cyclone, for example. We also need to think about what public infrastructure there is in our communities. You know, what roads are they, and what are those roads like? Are they tarred with good drainage, or are they untarred? What services are there? What's the status of electricity and sanitation, for example? And what about public buildings? Are there schools? Are there offices? Are there industrial facilities? You know, these kind of buildings. Another thing that's important to consider exposure is the population structure. If you imagine a community with an aging population, they might be much more exposed to heat stress because of the particular vulnerability of older people to heat than younger people. So what's the population structure like in the community in question? And then we also need to understand what is it people do here to make a living. Then we can try and work out how exposed they are to the different climate hazards. And in particular, we're interested in to what extent are people's lives and livelihoods dependent on natural resources. And then also what kind of buildings do they live in? Because a lot of the negative impacts of climate risk come from people being harmed because they're in structures that are very vulnerable when there's exposure to a climate hazard. So these are the kind of contextual questions that we need to understand to progress with a climate vulnerability assessment. So I'm going to give you an example of kind of answering some of those questions for a particular community. So this particular village is in a linear shape, so it's alongside a river. And about half of the houses in this linear community are found in the floodplain, and a lot of the farmland is found in the floodplain. And then around the houses, there's a natural woodland area. There's one major untarred road that goes alongside the river, and then there's a few smaller roads which run perpendicular to that and parallel. So we've got almost like a little grid structure alongside the river, with the main road very close to the river. This particular village is electrified, but not all residents can afford the electricity connections. There's one school and one creche. So in terms of public buildings, those are the public buildings here. If we think about the population structure, there's a roughly even distribution between working age adults, particularly women, because a lot of the times their husbands are working away in the city, and children, and then a smaller proportion of elderly population. And the majority of residents in this particular community are reliant on small-scale farming of maize, with some employed in local industries and some with formal sector jobs in the nearby town, but the majority definitely is involved in farming. And then if we think about houses, there's variability. The majority are traditional style mud brick with grass roofs, but there are some that are made with cement brick and tin roofs as well. So if we're to try and understand the vulnerability of people living in this particular context, as well as understanding what climate hazards exist, as we've already identified in the previous stage, we also need to kind of understand this context to be able to look at the different levels of exposure to those climate hazards going forward. So that's just one example. What I would like you to do now is, for the community that you've had in mind already, where you've been thinking about the climate hazards, I'd now like you to kind of complete a bit of a summary of that community using these criteria outlined here as the next stage in our climate vulnerability assessment. So again, just kind of think about how you would be able to summarize the situation based on these different criteria, and then write all of this down, because again, we're going to use it with the climate hazard information you've just identified going forwards. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, I think it does, Catherine, but maybe once again, if you just give them an example of, then they can also relate with their situations.
So that's what I was trying to outline with this example. So here, basically, what I did with here is I've used those different criteria to kind of answer in the context of the particular community that I'm thinking about, what that circumstance is like.
All right.
So imagine, all of us are working in very different communities and we don't understand the context. So give as much information as you can that can enable the rest of us to, really build up a mental picture of what your particular community context is like, because then we need that to be able to identify differences in exposure. Is that clear for everyone? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm hoping that's all clear and you're already starting to think about it. There's quite a few questions there, so I'll give you a good 10 minutes to be able to come up with a picture, and then again, I'll invite a couple of you to feed back to all of us. If you do have any questions, of course, feel free to either type them in the chat or feel free to just speak up, that's fine. maybe when you're finished, feel free to even just write finished in the chat box, because of course, unlike in a room where I could see if everyone looks like they're finished, of course I can't see now. So I know we have asked you to think about quite a few things.
Catherine, I think they and we can go ahead.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I see a few people have put the comments in the chat box. Maybe I can invite either those who've typed them or anyone else to paint a picture for us of what your community looks like, so that we can start thinking about the exposure. Who would like to start?
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Tell us about what your context is like.
Okay. Topographically, my area is built on a mountain. It's very mountainous.
Okay.
We hardly have a lot of trees. We don't have a lot of trees. What we do have is large grazing areas because it's a village. So
okay.
we have very, very large grazing areas. We have a river that runs on the side through the side of the village, but no rivers on the inside of the village, just on the side of the village.
Okay.
The water course, I'm not sure if the water course, if I should just say it's the river, because it's just one river.
Yeah, that's fine. If there's no other sources of water, then that's fine.
Yeah, there's no other sources of water really. The coast, no, it's an inland area. There are no coasts. It's an inland area.
Okay.
When it comes to roads, the roads are untarred. It's gravel roads. Yes, we have gravel roads. Services, we have very sufficient electricity supply. I'd be lying if I complained about that, but we do lack in water. Electricity and sanitation, yes, we are good on that side, but we do lack on water. Low water is a common problem in our area.
Okay.
When it comes to public buildings, we have a school. It's a public school. So it's a high school and a community hall, and we also have a church hall. Those are the public buildings we have in my area.
Okay.
We also the population structure. I'm not really sure about the gender, but the age. I'd say my village is really dominantly possessed by the youth. We are more populated in that area, and then it's those. I'm not sure if I should say middle age, but it's between the ages of 36 and 52. And then we have those elderly people after that. I'm not really sure about the gender though. I can't specify really about the gender. How my people make a living, those who are employed, we usually have those EPWP programs, those independent development trust programs that's how we get basic employment and those day-to-day jobs, those small jobs in town. That's how most of us get employment. If you're not properly educated, then you that's how many of us get jobs, and it's a basic source of income. I wouldn't say we're really naturally resource dependent. No, we are. I wouldn't say that. We're not really in that way. The buildings they live in, mostly they mud structured, but as of recently, I think past 2 years, we do have RDP houses. So I'd say 75% of the population in the village, they do have RDP houses in that area, in my area. Thank you very much. I think that's just about it.
Great, thank you. That paints a really nice picture. Just one question. You mentioned the grazing land. So is that like for small livestock or large livestock, or just wild? What's the situation with that?
Livestock, ma'am. Very large livestock, because there's different families and they have very different cows and goats and sheep. You know. So like for example, my family, I think we have 17 cows and 34 goats. So we need those grazing lands.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm sure you can imagine why I was asking that, because of course, as we're going through, we're trying to add together the different pictures of the process. So I mean, if one of the climate hazards that's been identified is increasing temperatures, and lots of people have livestock have different levels of vulnerability to temperature increase. So, it may well be, what we're going to be kind of coming to next is looking at the coincidence of the climate hazard with the context. And then we'll start to build up the picture of what the specific nature of climate vulnerability is. So that's great. That was a really good first example to paint a really nice picture of the context for us. Thank you. Great. Anyone else like to share? I can see there's 37 people on the call, and I definitely haven't heard 36 other voices. So please don't be shy. We want to hear what you have to say, and of course, there's lots of different contexts represented here. So it's always interesting to hear those different contexts.
Yeah, Sindisco, maybe can we hear from you?
Yeah, please go ahead. Great.
Is it me you want to talk?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. No, the place that we are working on is an informal settlement, which is riddled with abject poverty. And the topography is fairly flat in an area, and rivers are eccentric, so access to river water is not that easily accessible. Roads are tarred, but once leading to the actual areas where people live, you find a lot of gravel road, most of which are inaccessible on very extreme weather days, like when it is raining, because you really need to navigate through to get to people. Electricity is there, and there's water supply from municipality, but sanitation is still a problem. Some areas are using septic tanks as well as pit toilets.
Okay.
Public buildings, you do have halls, schools, and creches. There are more female than males, and mainly middle-aged people and children. They are mainly grant dependent. And there are some community gardens, but they are sparse and few in between. And the houses, there are RDP houses and shacks that are predominant, but people are doing something now to improve on the structures and give them more, with civilization, more cement structures. I think that will be my part for it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you've also just reminded me of that I should say another reason why it's important for us to do climate vulnerability assessments is, you know, we know that there's lots of places in South Africa where there are obviously significant development needs, and given that climate change is happening and is going to continue to happen, we need to also make sure that we design development interventions that are going to generate benefits for our people, that are going to continue to be robust and resilient in the face of that changing climate. So even in circumstances where, you know, where we think, oh, well, maybe climate vulnerability is not that significant because there are other problems at play here, it's still important for us to understand that climate vulnerability context so that we can design future development interventions effectively. And I often say, with regards to adaptation, I often say that all adaptation should be development. You know, all adaptation activities should bring developmental benefits to people, but not all development is adaptation, because sadly, a lot of the development activities that we do at the moment, we don't take climate into account, and then we run the risk of maladaptation and situations in the future where benefits end up getting undermined. So, yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight that climate vulnerability assessments are important for that kind of future looking as well. Great, thank you. I think we'll take 2 more examples, please. Who would like to go next?
Hello, Katharina.
Hi, please go ahead.
Hi, Patricia from Adelaide.
Great.
The Adelaide office would like to have clarity on the first question of you. We do understand the others, but we are not clear about what is the natural environment like. Then there's that topography, whatever, we are not clear about that.
Okay, no, I was just thinking in terms, I mean, imagine you're describing the community to someone who's not, yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think it's working. Yeah, so with the natural environment, it's kind of explaining the kind of physical circumstances. You know, is this community over, you know, a vast low-lying plain, or is it, you know, as one of the examples we've had already, is in a very steep area? You know, are there trees? Are there no trees? You know, what does it look like if, you know, if someone were to kind of arrive there out of nowhere? What would they expect to see in terms of natural features of the environment, as opposed to, you know, buildings that we create and people that would be there? Does that make sense?
Okay.
So do you want to tell us what you'd put down already for the other parts of the context? Sorry, I can't see your name because it's just showing a number.
We are there on the chat box. Okay.
Ah, did you put it in the chat box? Oh, feel free to go ahead and speak it out, so we can. It's helpful to get the picture.
Okay, we start with public infrastructure.
Okay.
Okay, the athlete, the road. The roads are tight, but not all. But it depends on paving.
Okay.
Something the road. The services, electricity, and sanitation. We have it. That's it. But the public buildings, the schools, the churches, and community halls, and the clinics, banks, and post office, we have it here.
Okay.
The population structures, the population structure and the gender, we have male and females, but in the youth, we most of go outside here because of the shortage of work.
Okay, what to add on what he's saying, that when it comes to the population structure, most of our people are going outside due to not having work opportunities here.
Yeah.
Only WP and that whatever, that small social grants and whatever, but there's no work opportunity. So the people has to go outside to other towns to look for work. Then that small projects, which the community projects, we are grouping ourselves, but in most of the people, it's the middle ages, we can say that it's between 40 and, but there are 40 small or youth, but it's a little few. Social grant people, disability grant people, and the CWPs, and then the projects. Then
And the kind of buildings were here, the RTP housing, and some of the buildings, the shacks.
Informal settlements. It's
That is all.
Thank you, Katarina.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah, so again, another example where knowing the climate vulnerability could help to design adaptation interventions that create development opportunities that will be resilient in the face of a changing climate. Great, thank you. Okay, let's have one more, please.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, go ahead.
Okay, it's me again, Luke from Stellenbosch, Kayamandi. Okay, so with regards to the natural environment, the topography, it's a very slopey area. There's many highs and lows in terms of the area. I can almost describe it as like a heartbeat that goes up and down. So that's how the area basically looks. With regards to water courses, there's a river, but they don't really use it for water because there's already access to water. And the coast, it's the Cape West Coast. So it's approximately Stellenbosch, Kayamandi. It's approximately like 30 kilometers away from Strand Beach or Makassar Beach. And with regards to the public infrastructure, so there are tarred roads and there is access to water and electricity and sewage systems. Eskom is the supply of the electricity, but sometimes they're very inconsistent with the load shedding. So there is access to electricity if Eskom is in the mood, if you know what I mean.
I think we all know what you mean with that one, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the city of Cape Town is the supply of the water. Public buildings, there's about 4 schools there. There are many churches, and there's also a community clinic. With regards to the population structure, it's a very difficult thing to pin down. You can't really say. I know there's a lot of kids, young children between 10 and 20, say 10 to 20. They're the majority, but there's really a balance between male and female. And what do people do to make a living? So Stellenbosch is like a big farm area. So let me just put it in context. It's a big farm area. Then there's like a CBD, and where we located Kayamandi is almost like on the outskirts or the outside of Stellenbosch. So many people then go to town to find work, so they work in shops, and the rest of the people that work on farms, and especially wine farms. So it's like big commercial farms, and in season they find a lot of work there. But now with climate change, that also affected the work because harvesting season is a bit shorter, so there's not much work. Are they naturally resources dependent on natural resources? Not really, because even though many people work on farms, it's commercial farms and not subsistence farms. So they don't really depend that much on natural resources like it's those big farms. We just get the wage. You don't get some of the grapes or something like that. And the kind of buildings they live in, it's mostly RDP houses and informal settlements. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that's interesting because that's an example where, yeah, people's livelihoods, because of the nature of farming in the area, then people's livelihoods, even if it's a job within a farming environment, as you said, is related to climate. Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you for the others who have typed in the chat box as well. I do think, you know, this is just demonstrating again in the same way, you know, pretty much all of us are from thinking about different community contexts, and we've all got slightly different climate hazards, and we've all got very different community contexts, which means that our exposure to those hazards is very different. And this is kind of demonstrating exactly why we need to do climate vulnerability assessments, because we can't assume that climate change is going to mean the same thing for everyone, regardless of where they are, because of course that is definitely not the case. Now, we're coming to the end of our time together for today, and we haven't finished going through the examples of the kind of exposure step. As I'm sure you can imagine, the next thing we're going to do is kind of build together, well, given the climate hazards that we've identified and the community context that we've identified, what's the specific nature of the exposure, and then we'll move on to vulnerability. But just before we close, I did want to say at this point, I know it's going to be a while, a few days before we're able to meet again. So if you would like to, this is not compulsory, and we won't be necessarily using it directly when we meet again. But if you would like to kind of continue this idea of thinking through a climate vulnerability assessment for your community, one of the things that you might want to think about is mapping out the context that you've just identified, and then thinking about, are there areas where the climate hazards are more important than others? I mean, we've spoken about rivers, and proximity to rivers is obviously an issue with flooding. I can give another example from a climate vulnerability assessment I did in Zambia, where one of the climate hazards that they'd identified was frost, that was killing crops a lot in winter. And when they mapped out what the community looked like and mapped out where the different hazards were taking place, the frost was only in a particular lowland area, which happened to be very shaded. So that was geographically, that was the only part of the community that was really experiencing the frost, and it was just as a result of the geography, basically. But again, you know, when we're doing a climate vulnerability assessment, we need to understand which places and which people are vulnerable in what ways. So kind of being able to map this out spatially helps to further build that picture. So certainly one of the things that you could think about in this same vein is, if you had to map out the context that you've just described, what would it look like? And then if you were to think about the distribution of the hazards that you mentioned, is there a difference within your community around that exposure? Great. Before we close for today, are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to raise based on what we've discussed so far?
I don't see any hand.
I mean, this is what I dislike about being online, because I would much prefer that we were able to be in a room discussing this, and we could all see each other. It might make it a bit easier.
Today also I've been interested in seeing each other's little maps. But yeah, it's the times that we are in.
Yes, we make the best of it. Yeah, for sure. Okay. If anyone does have any questions, I know sometimes as well, we've obviously covered quite a few things. I know sometimes questions arise later as things start to settle in your mind. So if anyone does have any questions or would like clarification on anything once it's had a chance to settle in your mind, you're very welcome to email me in the coming days, even before we speak again. I'll put my email address in the chat box in case anyone would like to do that. But as I'm not seeing any questions, maybe, yeah, Sandra, shall I hand back to you to close?
Thanks so much, Catherine. Thank you very much. We really learned a lot today. Thank you very much. Before I close, I just want, there is Seth, who is the program manager. Seth, I would want you to just say a few words, especially with this group of participants whom we had. I'm sure, Catherine, you were also impressed with the level of participation. That yes. Seth, can you just have a few words?
Sandra, Seth had left the session to attend a meeting.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure is Joan with us or she's also.
Unfortunately, she left as well to attend the meeting.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. I would like to thank you all for your participation and thanks to Catherine as well. Please make sure that you do your activities on WhatsApp, and just to remind everyone that we are currently accepting the micro grants application. The core grants, we will let you know when you will start submitting the core grants application. I do see some are already submitting the core grants. You won't be able to submit core grants because these lessons, especially on vulnerability assessment, and we'll still have a workshop on core grants application, will help you to produce a good proposal. So for the core grants, hold on, don't send your applications now. But for the micro grants, you can please submit your applications. And